Only second to death row, a life sentence is the worst possible punishment that can be handed to an offender. From the longest sentences in history to innocent men that served decades behind bars, and the one that made it out and became president. This video compiles some of the most amazing stories of people who served extremely long sentences and lived to see the sun, be free, and tell the tale. Ricky Jackson. Let us start off with one of the most outrageous stories you will ever hear, and a record-breaking one too. Ricky Jackson was wrongfully convicted at the peak of his teenage years and ended up spending 39 years in prison. Finally getting his freedom at the age of 56, Jackson is currently the longest-serving convict that ended up getting exonerated. After getting arrested for the murder of a money order salesman named Harold Franks, Jackson and two others were convicted primarily based on the testimony of a 12-year-old child. 12-year-old Eddie Vernon testified and identified Ricky Jackson, Wiley Bridgman, and Ronnie Bridgman as the culprits responsible for the death of Harold Franks. The trio was thrown into prison based on this testimony, but then, years later, a plot twist hit the story. After Jackson had spent 39 years in the dark box fighting to prove his innocence, Eddie Vernon came forward with a confession that he had lied against the convicts. He recanted his testimony publicly, claiming it was a result of coercion by the police to put the three young adults behind bars. Furthermore, new evidence was uncovered that supported the fact that Jackson was innocent of the murder accusation. In November 2014, with evidence beyond doubt, Ricky Jackson and the Bridgman brothers were exonerated and released to walk as free men again. Harvey Stewart. Here's a guy that spent no less than 6 decades behind bars. Not a record anyone would want to boast about, but this is arguably one of the longest sentences served by anyone. After serving 60 years, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles deemed it fit to release him on parole, considering a recent history of good behavior, deteriorating health, and old age. Stewart had spent most of his early years in an exciting life of crime. He would rob brothels in the southeast of Texas for a massive payday of $3,000 on a single job. But his prison life was a little more interesting. His first taste of prison was in 1951 when he got a 10-year sentence for robbing a junkyard. He managed to make it out of prison after 6 years on parole. Just a year after release, however, he was back behind bars on a murder conviction that he claimed was a result of self-defense. During this sentence, Stewart escaped from prison but was caught just a few days after his escape. This time, it took another 26 years for Stewart to get paroled in 1984. But guess what? The man was back in prison again in 1986, just 2 years later. He was convicted on a fresh robbery charge. After serving a total of 60 years, making him the longest-serving Texas prisoner in history, Harvey Stewart was granted release on parole in 2011. Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby. If you have ever experienced denial, you most likely never had it as bad as Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby. Johnson received a life imprisonment sentence for killing a man in a bar fight after having a couple of drinks. His sentence began in 1908, and during his time in prison, he consistently appealed for parole, but was denied a whopping 33 times. After serving for 66 years, he was granted parole at the age of 89 years. He was now believed to no longer be a threat to society, but interestingly, the story does not end there. Being 89 years old was bad enough, but Johnson also had the stain of being an ex-convict on his record. Ultimately, this affected his ability to find a reasonable job that would help him survive. After trying and failing to get a paying job, Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby did something you would never expect. He decided to voluntarily check himself back into prison despite committing no crimes during his parole. At least he had feeding, clothing, and shelter, and was not causing any trouble. He spent 2 more years in prison and then decided to leave and face whatever the world was ready to throw at his tired 91-year-old body. He was able to live another 10 years outside of prison before dying at the age of 101 years old. What a life. Craig Coley. Let's move from the convict that struggled to get parole and a job to one that received a massive payout for the time he spent in prison due to wrongful accusation. But could all the money in the world make up for 38 years lost to captivity? In 1987, Craig Coley went from a regular dude living in California to a convicted murderer. At the time, evidence was presented against him proving he had murdered his 24-year-old girlfriend and her 4-year-old son. Sadly, this is yet another awful story of law enforcement wrongfully putting good people in a very bad place. In 2018, when Coley was now 71 years old, he was granted a full pardon by the former governor of California, Jerry Brown. New DNA evidence had surfaced that proved his innocence, alongside a possibility of manipulation and mishandling of evidence by the investigators involved in the case. The sitting district attorney at the time Coley was convicted had presented false evidence to the court that nailed an innocent man. Thankfully, Craig Coley survived long enough to make it out of prison after he was found to be innocent of the crime. On release, release, Coley got a settlement deal that offered him $140 for every day he spent in a prison cell. This equated to around $21 million. While this sounds like a lot of money, for Craig Coley, the experience of going to prison could never be paid away. Eddie Collins. Eddie Collins was 21 years old and out buying drugs with his 17-year-old younger brother Johnny, a drug deal gone bad. The men got into a bit of a squabble, and in a matter of seconds, Johnny Collins grabbed a gun from nowhere. Before Eddie could do anything about the weapon, Johnny had taken the shot. The dealer died a few hours after. The brothers went on the run for about a day, but were eventually delivered to the cops by their mother. Both brothers got a first-degree murder charge alongside a plea deal offer. Johnny took the deal and served a 10-year sentence for manslaughter. Eddie, on the other hand, refused to take the deal that would have kept him in prison for 20 years. During his trial, the jury tried to nail Eddie Collins for manslaughter, but the judge would not let that happen. He was eventually convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After spending 30 years in prison, Eddie's lawyers attempted to get him clemency on 3 different occasions. However, despite getting approval from the board, the governor at the time, Janet Napolitano, refused to sign off on it. Well, thanks to a change in the criminal code, Eddie Collins could apply for parole, but that was not an easy task either. The board pushed and shoved Collins with everything they could to ensure that he could stay under control and not cause harm if let into the world. After 43 years in prison and several years of trying to get out, he could finally go home. "I feel like I had died and gone to heaven," said Collins. Francis Clifford Smith. Francis Clifford Smith holds the record of the longest prison sentence served in the state of Connecticut. Smith was convicted for allegedly playing a role in the murder of a 68-year-old night watchman at the Indian Harbor Yacht Club. Smith was served the death penalty by electrocution. His head was shaved in preparation for the execution, and he was probably already thinking about his last words. But just 2 hours before he would receive a shock to death, the Board of Pardons made the call to have the sentence commuted to a 25 years to life prison sentence. Francis Clifford Smith spent about 70 years in prison, apart from 2 very short intervals. The first was for 12 days in 1967 after Smith had broken out of a prison farm in Enfield. He got parole in 1975, but was only out for 10 months before he broke the terms of his release and was thrown back in. After spending decades and growing old in jail, Francis Smith was finally released in September 2020. But it could have been earlier, though. Smith accepted parole after the board offered a place at the 60 West facility. This was a private housing system for parolees who were advanced in age. Smith is now said to be under supervised parole. The sad part of this story, however, is that after so many years, it has now come to light that he could have been innocent. A confession was reported to have been forced by the prosecutor, witness testimony was recanted, and someone even came forward to identify himself as the accomplice. Decades later, it is now discovered that Francis Smith did not get a fair chance at acquittal and could have died for it. Paul Geidel Jr. When it comes to extremely long sentences, Paul Geidel Jr. is something of a legend, a deserving status for someone who spent nearly 69 years behind bars. Born to an alcoholic bartender in 1894, Geidel lost his father at the tender age of 5. He was tossed into the system, spending a large chunk of his childhood in an orphanage. By the time he turned 14, he decided to leave school and start making a living in the real world. He tried his hands on a number of jobs in his hometown, Hartford, before doing other stuff at hotels in New York City. The course of Paul Geidel's life is completely altered for the worst on the 26th of July, 1911. If you are doing the math, Geidel was now about 17 years old, working as a bellhop at the Iroquois Hotel in New York City. Geidel carried out a robbery and murder of an old rich broker who was a guest at the hotel. The young bellhop slipped into the guest's room and used a rag filled with chloroform. For his troubles, Geidel was able to get out of the situation with a few dollars in his pocket from the robbery. Within 2 days of committing the offense, Geidel Jr. was arrested and then went on to be charged with second-degree murder. This landed him a massive sentence of 20 years to life in prison. Interestingly, after maintaining good behavior and a relationship with prison officials, Geidel received a shortened sentence as a result of good behavior. However, he was not granted parole on the grounds that doctors declared him legally insane in 1926. He was moved from one facility to the next over time, taking this time to build a relationship with the people in charge of the prisons. By the time Geidel was finally granted parole in 1974, he was now 80 years old and did not want to leave. After spending 63 years of his life behind the walls of the prison, he did not know any other life. He had no known family members. Surviving on his own on the outside did not look feasible. Geidel was willing to stay in prison for almost 6 years more before finally deciding to leave. By May 7, 1980, Paul Geidel Jr. had now served the longest prison sentence in the history of the United States that ended on his release. As he made his way out of the facility, he requested that the press avoid turning his story into a publicity stunt. John Phillips. Speaking of 17-year-olds that ended up in prison, here is John Phillips, a man with no desire to walk free. When most people get thrown in a cell, the only thing they ever dream of within those dark walls is the day they will finally walk out. For John Phillips, he couldn't care less about what life would look like outside the walls of the prison. John Phillips began his sentence in the summer of 1952 for raping a 5-year-old girl. While Phillips claimed to be innocent of this crime, the circumstances surrounding his case made it a difficult situation for him. Based on an account of Phillips's trial, an evaluation carried out at a mental facility revealed that he had the mind of a 7-year-old. Now, regardless of this evaluation, the report also stated that he knew right from wrong regarding the charges against him. His lawyer did not hesitate to enter a guilty plea that allowed him to serve a life sentence rather than getting thrown into a gas chamber. His stance on being innocent was not considered based on the fact that people with mental or intellectual disability were not known to make accurate confessions. After spending years behind bars, a 1991 article listed John Phillips as the longest-serving prisoner in North Carolina. The article moved mountains as the prison decided to work on his release. At this time, Phillips was not interested in leaving, so he declined their offer. After spending over 68 years in prison, now in his 80s, trying and failing multiple times to get paroled, John Phillips finally got released on parole in 2021. Phillips was asked later why he took the guilty plea while still claiming to be innocent of the crime. John Phillips said, "They told me I could live." Joseph Ligon. Early life was quite the struggle for young Ligon. Growing up on a farm meant that he did not have access to the luxuries of life. He eventually dropped out of school in about 4th grade without properly learning to read or write. By the time he turned 13, he moved with his family to Philadelphia. In February of 1953, Ligon was hanging out with a group of other teenagers, 2 of which had been drinking. The group of 5 started robbing people for money to buy more alcohol. After consuming 2 bottles of wine, the group of teens, who barely knew their left from their right, hit the streets of Philadelphia and stabbed 8 men. 2 of the men that were stabbed eventually died. It was the very first time Ligon had tasted alcohol, and the activities of that night are what he now considers stupid and horrible. Ligon later stated that he was not allowed legal representation or even visitation from his family before he was forced to sign a confession cooked up by the police. A 15-year-old who did not know how to read ended up in front of a judge in a 1-day trial, receiving a life sentence for first-degree murder. While Joe Ligon maintained that he was innocent of the crime, he admitted to stabbing one of the men that survived. After the Supreme Court deemed it unconstitutional to sentence juveniles to life without a chance at parole, Ligon's sentence was revised to 35 years in prison. Considering how long he had already spent in prison, he could immediately apply for parole, but Ligon did not like the idea of release on parole. He had always believed that he was unconstitutionally sentenced, so he went back to court to fight the parole, and he won. Joseph Ligon was set free in February 2021 without parole. Joseph Ligon became a free man after 68 years behind bars. Otis Johnson. The world was a very different place when Otis Johnson was born. His black mother had to get a Caucasian couple she had nannied to sign as his parents just so that she could get access to appropriate health care. By the time Johnson got into his teenage years, he had made a reputation for fighting back at bullies. Johnson's father had him move to Hong Kong to live with monks and learn discipline and martial arts. The facts surrounding Otis Johnson's case have raised a lot of eyebrows over the years. Apart from the fact that his alleged initial arrest was made based on an anonymous call, only the officers involved in the case identified Otis Johnson as the culprit that shot a cop. Furthermore, a .22 caliber gun was uncovered in a basement that the police claim was on the escape route. A search warrant was never filed. There were no prints on the gun, and Johnson was not checked for any gunpowder residue that would at least tie him to the crime. Even worse, at the start of the trial, a 14-year-old boy came forward to prove that Otis Johnson was not guilty of the crime. After his testimony, the judge excused the witness and asked the jury to disregard all of his testimony. Much less than ideal legal work was done to help Otis stand a chance against the system. Otis Johnson was eventually convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for the attempted murder of a police officer. Johnson spent 40 years of his life behind bars, and during this time he obtained 2 college degrees and attended self-help programs that allowed him to be a beacon of light to other inmates. Johnson has been in 9 different parole hearings, and 8 out of 9 times, while the board admitted that he had exhibited great behavior, he was denied parole because he did not admit to the crime. On the 9th attempt, in August 2014, after a ton of back and forth, Otis Johnson was released on parole with nothing more than his papers and $40. The world had really moved far from what he remembered it to be like 4 decades ago. Walter Bork. Walter Bork has spent 67 years in prison, and while he is still in prison, he has made this list on the grounds that he could have been a free man despite the gruesome nature of his crime. Bork received an 18 years to life sentence in 1955 for the murder of a 4-year-old girl named Patricia Johnson. Bork had been sexually assaulting the child and decided to kill her because he was scared of her parents. He axed the 4-year-old to death and buried her in his parents' cellar. At the time crime was committed, Bork was only 17 years old. The prosecutors demanded the death penalty by hanging for his crimes, but the jury went for a second-degree murder ruling considering his age. The first conversation about release on parole started in 1966, but this was immediately denied, standing on the nature of the crime committed. He was gearing up for release again in 1977, but this was ruled out on accusation of inappropriate activities with minors. Bork attended a sex offenders program in 1978 and 1979, but was thrown back in prison for stealing a check. At this stage, Bork is now aware that he may never be free from the four walls of prison, and he is comfortable with that fact. Richard Honick. Richard Honick was the co-perpetrator of a crime that was premeditated and years in the making. His crimes cost him just over 64 years of his life. Honick was convicted for the murder of Walter F. Kohler, however. This was not the start of his story. Years before killing their former school friend, Honick and Hundhausen had been arrested for setting several fires. Kohler took the stand to testify against the Honick and Hundhausen, and from that moment, the criminal duo vowed to get revenge. You would not expect them to get revenge with an even worse crime, but they did, and had a very elaborate plan for how it would be executed. They geared up with multiple options for the kill: a 16-inch Bowie knife, a silver-plated case knife, a 44 caliber revolver, a 22 caliber revolver, a 38 caliber revolver, and 2 belts of cartridges. The victim was found in his room with a stab in the back. Hundhausen had confessed that Honick did the stabbing with an 8-inch Bowie knife. Their detailed plan also consisted of their means of escape, however. That part did not really work out as planned. Honick was arrested and condemned to life imprisonment for his troubles. After a rough patch in the first few years of prison life, he finally began to get his act together before getting paroled in 1963. 64 years after he first walked through the prison gate, Honick was now 85 years old. Howard Christensen. Howard Christenson's story is the perfect example of a really bad escape plan. Christensen was just 17 years old when he got convicted of murder. All he and his friend Norman Westberg wanted to do was move from Chicago to the more volatile South Dakota area for reasons best known to them. Still, there is no crime in wanting a little more excitement in your life, but their plan: flag down a person that would be kind enough to stop and give them a lift so that they could then steal their car. A plan that would have been pretty easy to execute if their victim was not a teacher named Ada Carey. Unfortunately, Carey fought back at the boys. Despite taking 2 gunshots and a hammer hit to the head, she was alive long enough to give the police everything they needed to find the culprits. Christensen and Westberg were eventually caught, taken to court, and convicted for the murder of Ada Carey. Westberg did not last very long before committing suicide in 1943. Christensen lived long enough to maintain a record of bad behavior in prison. His sentence was later commuted to the time he had already served, spending 58 years in prison. Christensen died 3 years after release. Charles Edrit Ford. Especially when you are likely innocent of the crime that you were put there for. Charles Edrit Ford was arrested and jailed for a brutal murder without a fair trial. Charles's conviction was set in the 50s, a black man set before an all-white jury to decide his fate. Charles Ford was accused of brutally murdering a man, starting the process with a gunshot and finishing it off by banging his brain out with the handle of the shotgun. However, based on evidence that has been gathered over time, there were several cases of misconduct on the part of the prosecutor. Apart from Ford stating that the police violently forced him to confess to the killing of Vincent Lewis, alibi witnesses were never summoned to testify. The witnesses that did testify against him had clashing testimonies, and his attorney never informed him of his rights. During a furlough from prison in 1975, Ford did pick up a second-degree assault charge that affected his retrial case in 2015, but even that had some inconsistencies to it, considering that the only thing tying him to the case was a rental car registered to Charles Ford that happened to be at the scene of the crime. Ford mentioned that the victim had pointed to another man in the courtroom, and all the judge had to say was that the person looked like him, Ford. After all was said and done, Ford finally received a suspended 5-year sentence and broke down in tears as soon as the judge passed the judgment. Clifford Hampton. Up next is yet another 17-year-old that ended up behind bars. Clifford Hampton killed his childhood friend, Bertha Ann Gibson, because she did not agree to have sex with him. The year was 1958, and Bertha was just 18 years old. Hampton could not keep his emotions under control so much so that he stabbed Bertha a total of 28 times. After the high of emotions had cleared from his eyes, he turned himself in. Unsurprisingly, Hampton was tried as an adult despite being a juvenile. The trial ended with a conviction and a life sentence. Just 3 years into his stay in prison, Hampton stabbed another inmate to death just because the said inmate had been pushing rumors about him. This landed him another life sentence. Clifford Hampton's prison time was riddled with a decent array of misconduct, everything from illegal materials to sex offenses. Apart from a gruesome murder from the 50s, all of these plagued his getting paroled and released. After several hearings, complications, and kickbacks later, the Louisiana Board of Pardons and Parole granted Clifford Hampton release. His sentence lasted 61 years. Henry Montgomery. In 1963, Henry Montgomery was just turning 17 when he was accused of shooting a white sheriff's deputy. About 60 black men got arrested as a result of this shooting, and multiple violent activities headlined the days leading to the trial. Henry was tried, convicted, and immediately handed the death penalty. However, in 1966, the Louisiana Supreme Court revoked the sentence, considering that the circumstances surrounding his trial were unfair. A retrial in 1969 got him a new life sentence without parole. Getting into prison as a teenager was really tough on Henry Montgomery, but he managed to grow into a model prisoner, counselor, and mentor to other inmates. By 2012, a ruling by the Supreme Court made it unconstitutional to sentence children to mandatory life without parole. This allowed Montgomery to start appealing for release on parole. His first appeal was denied because Louisiana courts were not applying the decision to cases that had already gone past the direct appeal process. It took another 4 years before the Supreme Court finally made it compulsory for all states to ban "till death do us part" sentences. The ruling got Montgomery an opportunity to now appeal for parole. He was denied parole twice in 2018 and 2019. However, in 2021, he was finally granted release. Richard Phillips. There is an endless list of people that have suffered the consequences of incompetence in the justice system, and there are very few who survive the blow. Richard Phillips is one more example of someone who had to pay the price for something he had no involvement in. Richard Phillips was convicted of murder in 1972 and served 45 years and 2 months for the crime. He was arrested, tried, and convicted based on the testimony of a witness who was the initial prime suspect in the case. The victim, George Harris, had gone missing for about a day before his wife found his abandoned car with bloodstains in the front seat. It took several months, but Harris's was later found by a maintenance worker. About 2 weeks after the body was found, the victim's brother-in-law, Fred Mitchell, was arrested for armed robbery and carrying a concealed weapon. But here's where the case gets really controversial. At the very beginning, no samples or photographs were taken of the victim's car, but also, Mitchell had been caught with a weapon that matched the murder weapon in Harris's autopsy report. Yet his testimony to the detectives implicated 2 other men, Richard Palumbo and Richard Phillips. He claimed that the 2 killed Harris, and within days, they were arrested on first-degree murder and conspiracy to murder charges. Shockingly, what Mitchell had to say was the only thing tying Phillips to this case. After taking the stand to testify, Mitchell contradicted things said both in court and during his interviews with the police. But somehow, Phillips and Palumbo still got convicted and sentenced to life without parole. It took 40 years, but Palumbo finally came forward to testify under oath that he and Mitchell were responsible. He claimed that he had only met Richard Phillips 8 days after they had committed the crime, and he was not involved. Mitchell just decided to pin it on Phillips and escape prosecution. It also turns out that an undisclosed deal had been made between the prosecution and Mitchell to apply leniency in the trial for his armed robbery charge if he testified against the 2. Philippa was finally released in 2017 and awarded a compensation of over $1.5 million. Anthony Mazza. Let us throw in one more extremely long sentence served by a completely innocent man. In fact, the story of Anthony Mazza and the 47 years he spent in prison is recorded as one of the longest sentences served by an innocent man. In 1972, police found the body of 34-year-old Peter Armada tied up and stuffed in a closet in an apartment belonging to one Robert Anderson. So how did Anthony Mazza come into the picture? Well, Anderson's testimony implicated Mazza. Anderson told the police that he had come home at an odd hour only to find Mazza in leather gloves, standing over the corpse. Mazza was then arrested, and on searching his home, police found a bank ID and driver's license belonging to the victim. Anderson got his charges dropped after agreeing to testify before a grand jury, and despite giving a testimony that was packed with inconsistencies, it was admitted in court. A few more witnesses added fuel to the fire with vague descriptions, and Mazza was on his way to prison in 1973 for first-degree murder and robbery. A life sentence without parole was the punishment handed out. Things did not look good for Mazza, as his legal team tried and failed multiple times to get a retrial. It was not until 2006 that a statement by Anderson's brother was discovered. William Anderson claimed that his brother Robert was very much involved in the murder than he had made known to the court. While you would expect this to be a major breakthrough to make his retrial easier, it took another 14 years for Mazza to get vacated of his conviction. Many denials later, Mazza was finally free of all charges in 2020 at the age of 73. Nelson Mandela. Here is the most iconic entry on this list. Nelson Mandela is probably the most famous person on this list, and while his sentence isn't the longest on this list, what he went on to achieve afterward is beyond amazing. Nelson Mandela received a 27-year sentence for reportedly trying to overthrow the government at the time. He fought against discriminatory regulations that were plaguing his home country. The government's crackdown on Mandela started with restrictions to travel, association, and even speech. In 1956, he was then arrested on a treason charge that was specifically set up to drag anti-apartheid activists. While he was acquitted after an extremely extended trial that dragged on till 1961, he was imprisoned again in 1963. This time, he and several others were tried on the grounds of sabotage, treason, and violent conspiracy. In 1964, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, just avoiding the death penalty. Nelson Mandela was finally released in 1990, and within 4 years of his release, he became the leader of his party and the president of South Africa, developing infrastructure that improved the quality of life for Black people in his country. It's a good ending to a sad video, I know, and there's more where that came from. Just click a card on your screen and I'll show you even more inspiring and heartbreaking stories.